A loyal dog remains beside its injured owner during a snowstorm, refusing to move. Rescuers arrive just in time to discover the dog's heartbreaking reason for staying. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. Tom stood at his living room window, wearing his heavy winter coat, watching the snowstorm intensify over his Vermont property. The thermometer outside read 15 degrees, and the wind whipped snow across his yard in white sheets. Rex, his German shepherd, bounded through the deepening snow, snapping at snowflakes and digging his nose into the drifts, seemingly immune to the cold. The house felt too quiet, too empty. Tom checked his watch. 9:15 a.m. He hadn't spoken to another person in 3 days. Not since the grocery delivery. His retirement routine had become mechanical. Wake up at 6, coffee, news, let Rex out. The same pattern, day after day, in this old farmhouse that seemed to grow larger and emptier with each passing season. Tom grabbed his winter gear methodically. Thick gloves, wool hat, insulated boots. The weatherman had warned against outdoor activities, but Tom needed to move. The walls of his house felt like they were closing in, and Rex's obvious joy in the snow was infectious. Besides, he knew these trails better than anyone. He'd walked them for over 60 years. Rex scratched at the door, recognizing Tom's preparation for their walk. His tail wagged with increasing speed as Tom double-checked his gear. The dog's enthusiasm brought a slight crack in Tom's otherwise stern expression. The blast of cold air hit him as he opened the door. Tom pulled his scarf tighter and stepped onto his porch, testing his footing on the snow-covered steps. Rex charged ahead, creating a path through the 8 inches of fresh powder that had accumulated since dawn. The trail behind his house disappeared into the woods, barely visible under the new snow. Tom followed Rex's tracks, his boots crunching through the surface crust. The familiar path brought back memories of his childhood, walking these same trails with Duke, his father's hunting dog. Duke had been a chocolate lab, patient and gentle. Tom remembered the Christmas morning his father brought the puppy home. He was 10 years old, and that dog became his constant companion through elementary school, middle school, and the first years of high school. Duke would wait by the mailbox every afternoon, rain or shine, for Tom's return from school. The wind cut through the trees, shaking more snow from the branches. Tom pulled his collar higher, protecting his neck from the icy particles. Rex ran ahead, then back to check on him, then ahead again. A pattern developed over their years together. The dog's black and tan coat stood out sharply against the white landscape. Despite the biting cold, the scenery was breathtaking. Fresh snow covered every branch and rock, transforming the familiar forest into something almost otherworldly. The clouds parted occasionally, sending shafts of sunlight through the trees that made the snow sparkle like scattered diamonds. Tom's boots left deep impressions in the snow as he followed the trail's gentle curve around a massive boulder. Beyond it, the valley opened up below them. The town of Milton lay spread out in the distance, its buildings looking like miniatures from this elevation. Smoke rose from chimneys in straight columns until the wind caught it. Rex pressed against Tom's leg, a solid, warm presence. His fur carried clumps of snow, but his brown eyes remained alert and focused on Tom, reading his mood as only a dog can. Tom reached down to scratch behind Rex's ears, feeling the strong bond between them. The forest's silence wrapped around them, broken only by the wind and the occasional creak of snow-laden branches. Up here, away from the emptiness of his house, Tom could breathe more easily. Winter had always been his favorite season in Vermont, even if the cold made his old injuries ache. The path ahead disappeared into a stand of snow-covered pines. Tom paused to catch his breath, watching Rex investigate a snow-covered log. The physical exertion of walking through deep snow had brought warmth to his muscles and color to his cheeks. For the first time in days, he felt truly present in the moment, not just going through the motions of existing. The sudden gust of wind came without warning, howling through the trees with unexpected force. Tom lifted his arm to shield his face from the blast of snow and ice. His boot, seeking purchase on the increasingly steep trail, slid across a hidden patch of ice beneath the fresh powder. Time seemed to slow as he lost his balance. The fall happened in stages. First, his right foot shot forward, the momentum pulling his body backward. His arms windmilled uselessly in the air. Then came the sickening sensation of freefall. Tom's back hit the slope first, followed by a violent slide down the snow-covered incline. He tried to dig his heels in to slow his descent, but the speed only increased. The impact came suddenly. His left leg caught on something solid beneath the snow, probably a fallen log or buried rock. The crack was audible even over the howling wind, a sharp snap that echoed through the trees. The pain hit a split second later, white-hot and overwhelming, radiating from his lower leg through his entire body. Tom lay still, the snow soaking through his coat. His breaths came in short, sharp gasps, creating small clouds in the frigid air. The initial shock gave way to a throbbing agony that made it impossible to think clearly. He tried to sit up to assess the damage, but the movement sent fresh waves of pain shooting through his leg. Rex was at his side in an instant, whining anxiously. The German Shepherd's paws left deep impressions in the snow as he circled Tom, occasionally nudging his master's shoulder with his nose. The dog's brown eyes showed clear concern, his ears forward and alert, tail low and still, a stark contrast to his playful behavior just minutes earlier. Tom gritted his teeth and attempted to move again. This time, he managed to prop himself up on his elbows. The sight of his left leg turned his stomach. While the heavy snow pants hid any visible injury, the unnatural angle told him everything he needed to know. It was broken, no question about it. With trembling hands, Tom reached for his phone in his coat pocket. The device felt impossibly cold as he pulled it out, his gloved fingers clumsy on the screen. The status bar at the top confirmed his worst fear. No signal. Of course not. He was too far up the trail, too far from the nearest cell tower. He'd known about this dead zone, but had never worried about it before. Frustration mixed with growing panic as Tom tried holding the phone higher, desperate for even a single bar of service. Nothing. The battery percentage showed 82%. Plenty of power, but useless without a connection. He let his arm drop back into the snow, fighting back a wave of despair. Rex continued his anxious pacing, occasionally barking as if trying to summon help. The snow was falling harder now, reducing visibility to just a few yards. The wind cut through Tom's wet clothes, and he could feel the cold beginning to seep into his bones. The pain in his leg remained intense, but now it was joined by a growing numbness that he knew could be dangerous. Tom tried to think logically through his options. He was maybe 2 miles from his house, possibly less as the crow flies, but with a broken leg, he couldn't walk. Crawling was out of the question. The snow was too deep, and the cold too intense. The trail wasn't frequently used, especially in weather like this. The chance of another hiker passing by was minimal. He checked his watch. 10:45 a.m. The temperature had dropped further, and the forecast had called for the storm to intensify throughout the day. Tom knew the dangers of exposure all too well. Hypothermia could set in quickly under these conditions. His wet clothes would only accelerate the process. Rex lay down beside him, pressing his warm body against Tom's side. The dog's presence provided some comfort, both physical and emotional, but it didn't change the gravity of the situation. Tom was trapped, injured, and slowly freezing, with no way to call for help and no guarantee anyone would come looking for him. He thought about his morning routine, how no one would miss him for days. The grocery delivery wasn't due until next week. His neighbors, the Hendersons, were in Florida for the winter. He had deliberately isolated himself from family and friends, and now that decision might cost him dearly. The cold and pain-triggered memories Tom usually kept locked away. As he lay in the snow, his mind drifted back to Afghanistan, to another time when he felt trapped and helpless. The desert heat was replaced by Vermont's bitter cold, but the feeling of vulnerability remained the same. He remembered Johnson, Martinez, and Cooper, friends who never made it home. The sound of their laughter in the mess hall, the way Johnson could tell stories that made everyone forget where they were, if only for a moment. Those memories had driven him to isolation after returning home. The guilt of surviving when others hadn't weighed heavily. He'd pushed away his wife, his daughter, anyone who tried to help. It was easier to be alone than to explain the nightmares, the sudden anger, the crushing weight of survivor's guilt that followed him home from the war. Tom shifted slightly, grimacing at the pain. Rex immediately raised his head, alert to any change in his master's condition. The dog's unwavering attention brought forth a different memory. The day they first met at the local animal shelter. 3 years ago, he hadn't planned on getting another dog. He'd gone to the shelter to deliver some old blankets, nothing more. But Rex had caught his eye immediately. The German Shepherd had been sitting quietly in his kennel, watching everyone pass by with intelligent, assessing eyes. Not barking like the other dogs, not trying to attract attention, just watching, waiting. The shelter worker had told him Rex's story, found wandering near a closed-down military base. No tags, no chip. No one knew his background, but he had clearly been trained. Tom remembered reaching out to let Rex sniff his hand. The dog had approached cautiously, then pressed his head firmly against the chain-link fence. Something in those brown eyes spoke to Tom, a shared understanding, perhaps. Both of them were soldiers without a mission, survivors looking for purpose. The adoption papers were signed that same day. Rex adapted to Tom's quiet lifestyle immediately, sensing when to offer companionship and when to give space. He learned Tom's routines, his moods, his triggers. On bad nights, when the memories became too intense, Rex would lay his head on Tom's lap, grounding him in the present moment. Now, as the snow continued to fall, Rex pressed closer against Tom's side, sharing his warmth. The dog's breathing was steady and calm, a contrast to the howling wind. Tom found himself talking to Rex, his voice rough from cold and emotion. "You're a good boy," he murmured, running a gloved hand through Rex's fur. "Better than I deserve, probably. Should have listened to the weather report, huh? Should have done a lot of things differently." Rex's ears twitched at the sound of Tom's voice, but he maintained his protective position. The dog's body heat provided a small buffer against the growing cold, and his presence helped keep the darker thoughts at bay. Tom continued talking, finding comfort in breaking the silence of the storm. He told Rex about Duke, his childhood dog, and about the friends he'd lost in the war. He spoke about his daughter Sarah's 5th birthday party, when she'd dressed up as a princess and made him wear a paper crown all day. About the last Christmas he'd spent with his family before the walls he'd built became too high to climb. The memories flowed freely now, perhaps loosened by the cold and pain. Tom realized he'd spent years running from these thoughts, but here, trapped in the snow with his loyal companion, he couldn't escape them. Strangely, facing them didn't hurt as much as he'd expected. Each remembered moment, good and bad, felt like reclaiming a piece of himself he'd locked away. Rex shifted positions slightly, moving to better shield Tom from the wind. The dog's fur was covered in snow, but his eyes remained fixed on Tom's face, attentive to every word. In that moment, Tom felt a profound connection with his four-legged guardian, a being who accepted him completely, without judgment or expectation. The temperature continued to drop as the storm intensified. Tom could no longer feel his fingers or toes, and the violent shivering had given way to an unsettling warmth, a warning sign of hypothermia he recognized from his survival training. His wet clothes had frozen stiff, crackling with every slight movement. The reality of his situation became stark. Without help, he wouldn't survive much longer. This clarity brought his thoughts to his family, to all the moments he'd thrown away. His daughter, Sarah's high school graduation, which he'd missed claiming he was sick. His wife, Ellen's attempts to get him to seek counseling after the war, met with stony silence until she stopped trying. The last Christmas invitation he'd received 3 years ago, returned unopened. Tom's mind fixed on that Christmas card. Sarah's handwriting on the envelope, the same swirling style she'd used since middle school. A family photo probably tucked inside. Sarah, Ellen, maybe even the grandchildren he'd never met. The card had sat on his kitchen counter for weeks before he mailed it back. Now, lying in the snow, he couldn't remember why it had seemed so important to maintain that distance. "I really messed up, Rex," Tom whispered through chattering teeth. The dog raised his head at the sound, snow falling from his fur. "Thought I was protecting them, you know, keeping my darkness away from their light. But maybe I was just protecting myself." He remembered the last time he'd seen Sarah. She'd shown up unannounced at his door 2 years ago, pregnant with her second child. He'd barely spoken, made excuses about having appointments, rushed her away. The hurt in her eyes haunted him now. She had her mother's eyes, Ellen's eyes, that used to look at him with such love, before he'd built his walls too high. Ellen had tried the longest to reach him. Notes left on the fridge, gentle suggestions about support groups, quiet presence during his nightmares. He'd responded with silence, anger, emotional absence, until she had no choice but to leave. He couldn't blame her. She deserved more than a husband who'd returned from war as a stranger. The cold seemed to reach his bones now. Tom's thoughts became sluggish, drifting between past and present. He saw Sarah as a toddler, taking her first steps toward him, Ellen in their first apartment, dancing to the radio while making dinner, the pride on his father's face when Tom enlisted. All these moments he'd buried under layers of guilt and pain, now surfacing as his body temperature dropped. Rex suddenly lifted his head, ears forward and alert. The change in the dog's posture was dramatic, from protective stillness to intense focus. Tom tried to concentrate, to hear what had caught Rex's attention, but the wind muffled everything. Then Rex stood, his movement careful to avoid jostling Tom's injured leg. The dog took several steps away, head high, testing the air. A low bark echoed through the trees, followed by another, more urgent one. Tom strained to lift his head, fighting against exhaustion and cold. "What is it, boy?" His voice was barely a whisper now. "You hear something?" Rex's barking increased in intensity and frequency, a clear call for attention. He would bark, pause to listen, then bark again. A pattern Tom had never heard from him before. The dog moved further up the trail, then back to Tom, then up again, like he was trying to lead something, or someone, to their location. Through the swirling snow, Tom thought he heard something, a voice, a call. He couldn't be sure if it was real, or if his oxygen-deprived brain was creating hallucinations. Rex certainly heard something, though, and the dog's behavior sparked a small flame of hope in Tom's chest. The rescuers appeared through the curtain of snow like ghosts, first as shadowy shapes, then solidifying into 3 figures in bright emergency gear. Rex's barking reached a crescendo before shifting to excited whines as he ran back and forth between Tom and the approaching rescuers. One of them called out, "Sir, can you hear me?" Tom tried to respond, but his voice came out as a croak. The cold had settled deep in his chest, making speech difficult. The first rescuer reached him, kneeling beside him in the snow. "I'm Mike with Search and Rescue. We've got you, sir. Just stay still." The next few minutes passed in a blur of professional efficiency. One rescuer, introducing herself as Sarah, the name sending a pang through Tom's heart, began assessing his injuries while another unfurled a thermal blanket. Mike spoke into a radio, confirming their location and requesting emergency transport. Rex refused to leave Tom's side until Mike gently coaxed him back, explaining they needed space to work. Even then, the dog stayed within viewing distance, his eyes never leaving Tom's face. The third rescuer noticed and commented, "Your dog saved your life, sir. We heard his barking from nearly half a mile away. Been doing this job 15 years, and I've never seen such dedicated behavior." Through the haze of cold and pain, Tom watched Rex standing guard. The dog's fur was caked with ice, his breath coming in visible puffs. but his stance remained alert and protective. The same dog who'd been abandoned at a military base had just ensured his master wouldn't be abandoned to the storm. The rescue team worked methodically to stabilize Tom's leg, their movements careful but quick. "Compound fracture," Sarah muttered to her colleagues. "We need to move fast." They wrapped him in multiple thermal blankets, applied a temporary splint, and prepared him for transport. "Your dog," Mike said as they worked. "He stayed on top of you, didn't he? Kept you warm." When Tom managed a nod, Mike continued, "That's probably what kept you alive. Body heat, basic survival instinct for them. But still, he's something special." The pain flared as they lifted him onto the rescue sled, but Tom barely noticed. His eyes were fixed on Rex, who paced anxiously nearby, whining softly. "Rex," he called out, his voice stronger now. "Come here, boy." Rex bounded over immediately, pressing his nose against Tom's hand where it stuck out from the blankets. The rescuers paused, recognizing the importance of the moment. Tom felt tears freezing on his cheeks as he looked into those loyal brown eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his frozen fingers finding the soft fur behind Rex's ears. "You didn't give up on me, even when I gave up on myself." The dog leaned into his touch, tail wagging slightly, completely unaware of the magnitude of what he'd done. The team secured Tom to the rescue sled, making sure he was stable for transport. One of them offered to take Rex on a leash, but the dog needed no guidance. He fell into step beside the sled as they began the careful journey down the trail, occasionally glancing up at Tom as if to ensure he was still there. Through the pain and cold, Tom made a silent promise, not just to Rex, but to himself. If he got through this, things would change. He'd been given a second chance, not just at survival, but at life itself. His loyal companion had done more than save him from the cold. Rex had shown him what unconditional loyalty truly meant. As they moved slowly down the mountain, Tom reached out again to touch Rex's fur. "When we get home," he murmured, "things will be different. We'll make it right." Rex pressed closer to the sled, his warm presence a constant reminder of the promise being made. At the hospital, Tom lay motionless, his leg encased in a cast from hip to ankle. The surgery to set the broken bone had gone well, but the doctors insisted he remain for observation. The sterile hospital room felt foreign and confining, a stark contrast to the open wilderness he loved. The hum of medical machines and the muffled voices outside his door reminded him of the years he'd spent in recovery after the war. A gentle knock on the door broke the monotony. A therapist named Dr. Collins entered, her demeanor calm and welcoming. She introduced herself and explained that she worked with patients on emotional recovery, particularly for veterans. Tom had expected the hospital to focus on his leg, not his mind, and he felt a surge of irritation. But Dr. Collins spoke gently, acknowledging his service and loss, which softened his resistance. "Sometimes, physical injuries bring up other kinds of pain," she explained. "It might help to express what you've been through, even if it's just for yourself." Tom considered her suggestion with reluctance. Talking had never come easy to him, but Dr. Collins left him with a notepad and a pen, suggesting he write letters to his family as a way to start reconnecting. "Even if you never send them," she said, "putting your thoughts down can be healing." When she left, Tom stared at the blank page, uncertain where to begin. His hand hovered over the pad, his mind a tangle of memories and regrets. He thought about Sarah and how many milestones he'd missed. The thought of his little girl, now grown and with children of her own, stirred something deep within him. He imagined her reading his words, perhaps trying to understand the man he'd become after the war. Slowly, he began to write, his handwriting shaky but steadying as he let his thoughts flow. The first letter to Sarah was raw and brief. He admitted his mistakes, his regrets, his wish to reconnect. Writing felt like a weight lifted, a small step toward breaking down the barriers he had built. As the days passed, he continued writing, opening up in ways he hadn't imagined. the pages filled with memories, apologies, and promises he hoped to keep. Each letter became a bridge to a past he hadn't allowed himself to revisit in years. The one companion he longed to see arrived a few days later. Rex had been allowed into the hospital, his presence approved as a therapy animal given the extraordinary circumstances of the rescue. When the nurse led Rex into the room, the dog bounded over to Tom, his tail wagging wildly. The sight of his loyal friend brought a lump to Tom's throat. Rex placed his head on Tom's chest, nuzzling close. Tom stroked his fur, feeling a surge of gratitude. "You saved me out there," he murmured. "Without you, I wouldn't be here, Rex." The dog's presence brought a sense of calm and comfort that no medication or therapy could replicate. Rex settled at the foot of Tom's bed, refusing to leave his side, providing silent encouragement as Tom worked through his thoughts, regrets, and plans for the future. Over the next few days, Rex became a fixture in Tom's hospital room. Nurses and doctors were charmed by the dog's loyalty, commenting on how he would lie beside Tom's bed, alert and watchful. Rex's warmth and steady presence grounded Tom, helping him face each day with a bit more strength. Dr. Collins returned for another session, this time to check on Tom's progress and encourage him further. She noticed the stack of letters on his bedside table and smiled. "You've written quite a few," she observed, nodding toward the growing pile. Tom glanced at the letters, a mix of gratitude and uncertainty crossing his face. "It's easier to write than talk. Words on a page don't look at you with disappointment or confusion," he admitted. Dr. Collins sat across from him, listening carefully. "Sometimes, sharing those words can be the hardest part," she replied gently, "but it can also be the most healing. Have you thought about sending them?" Tom hesitated, running a hand over the topmost letter. "Maybe. I haven't seen my daughter in years. I don't know if she'd even want to hear from me. I left a lot unsaid, pushed them all away." The therapist nodded, understanding. "The distance you created wasn't out of malice, Tom. You thought you were protecting them, but maybe it's time to let them in. They might surprise you." Her words lingered after she left, echoing in his mind. The thought of reaching out terrified him, yet he felt a spark of hope he hadn't known for years. Rex, as if sensing the shift in his mood, nudged his hand with his nose, bringing Tom back to the present. Tom scratched Rex's head, his touch lingering on the dog's soft fur. "I don't know how to do this without you, buddy," he whispered. As he recovered, Tom began preparing himself mentally for what lay ahead. He imagined conversations with Sarah, explaining the years of silence, the weight of memories he'd tried to carry alone. Each letter he wrote felt like a step closer to healing, but he knew that real healing would only come with direct connection. Finally, on his last day in the hospital, Tom tucked a few of the letters into an envelope, sealing it with a sense of finality. He planned to send them when he got home, deciding it was time to stop hiding behind excuses. The day Tom was discharged felt like the beginning of a new chapter. The hospital staff wished him well, and several of them patted Rex on the head, thanking the dog for his brave service. Tom managed a small smile as he limped out with Rex at his side, leaning on a crutch and feeling a sense of nervous anticipation he hadn't felt in years. His car was waiting out front, but the journey he was about to undertake was far more than the miles back to his farmhouse. Once he settled in at home, Tom looked around at the familiar surroundings. Everything seemed both comforting and haunting. The same quiet isolation he had once cherished now felt hollow. He placed his envelope with Sarah's letters on the kitchen counter, staring at it as if it held the weight of his past. The idea of reaching out was terrifying, but the thought of letting another year pass in silence felt even worse. Rex seemed to sense Tom's hesitation, his eyes fixed on his master with a quiet encouragement. Tom knelt down slowly, resting a hand on Rex's head. "Well, it's time we take that walk again, isn't it?" he said softly. With his legs still tender, they moved slowly along the trail where the accident had happened. The snow had mostly melted, but the path still held the faint imprint of their last journey. Every step reminded Tom of the promises he had made during those desperate hours. This time, instead of lingering memories of regret, he felt a strange sense of clarity. The solitude of the trail seemed less like an escape and more like a reminder of everything he'd gained, and everything he could lose if he didn't act. Returning home, he placed the letters in a larger envelope addressed to Sarah, his hands shaking slightly as he sealed it. He had written her phone number on the corner, wondering if he'd have the courage to call her as well. A few days later, after sending the letter, he received a reply. It was a text message from an unknown number. "Dad, it's Sarah. I got your letter. I'd like to talk. Could we meet?" Reading her words, Tom felt a rush of emotions that left him momentarily speechless. He sat down heavily in his old armchair, staring at the message until Rex padded over, nudging his hand. Tom scratched behind Rex's ears, taking a deep breath. "Looks like we're going to see Sarah, boy," he murmured, feeling both excitement and trepidation. The following day, he made the drive to Sarah's house, Rex sitting in the passenger seat. As he approached her front door, his heart pounded. When Sarah opened it, there was a moment of silence, a hesitation, a mix of emotions flickering across her face. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, her voice a blend of warmth and wariness. Tom managed a faint smile. "Hi, Sarah. I'm glad to see you." They stood there, uncertain, until Sarah stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. The embrace was tentative at first, but Tom felt something break inside him, the walls he'd spent years building crumbling under the weight of her forgiveness. Inside, he was introduced to his grandchildren, two bright-eyed kids who stared at him curiously. Rex immediately won them over, letting them pet him as he leaned into their touch. Tom watched, feeling a bittersweet ache as he realized how much he'd missed. Sitting down with Sarah, Tom struggled to find the words. "I'm sorry, Sarah, for all the years I stayed away, for shutting you out. I thought I was protecting you, but I see now that I was wrong." Sarah's eyes softened. "I know, Dad. I just wish you'd told me sooner, but you're here now, and that's what matters." As they continued talking, Tom felt the burden of his past lighten. He didn't need to explain everything in one day. This was only the beginning, but he could feel a quiet peace settling over him, the same peace he'd found on that snowy trail with Rex by his side. Later, as they prepared to leave, Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "Come back soon, Dad. We have a lot of years to catch up on." Tom nodded, glancing down at Rex, who was lying contentedly at his feet. "We'll be back, I promise." In the following weeks, Tom kept his promise, visiting Sarah and her family often. Each visit brought new memories and a chance to mend old wounds. Sarah was cautious at first, her trust tentative, but over time, the warmth between them grew. She shared stories about her life, her children, and the moments he had missed. Tom listened, grateful for each detail, his regrets slowly transforming into a determination to be part of their lives now. Rex, meanwhile, became a beloved fixture in Sarah's household. Her children adored him, and he took on the role of protector and playmate with ease. Watching Rex interact with his grandchildren brought Tom a profound sense of joy and relief. Rex wasn't just his companion. He had become the bridge that connected him to his family again. One afternoon, during a quiet moment, Sarah brought out an old photo album she'd found. She opened it to a picture of Tom, young and in uniform, holding her as a baby. The sight of his own face, so full of hope and pride, struck him deeply. The memories of those early days, the days before war and loss, had changed him, flooded back. "Mum kept all these," Sarah said softly. "She always hoped you'd come back to us, to me." Tom looked down, emotions welling up as he traced a finger over the photo. "I didn't know she kept them. I thought I'd lost everything." Sarah placed a hand on his. "We never stopped wanting you in our lives, Dad. Even when you pulled away, we were here, waiting." Her words cut through the last of the guilt he'd carried, and for the first time, He allowed himself to feel the love he'd tried to push away for so long. He realized that he hadn't just been given a second chance at survival on that snowy day. He'd been given a second chance at life itself. In the months that followed, Tom and Sarah's bond strengthened. He began to see her not just as his daughter, but as a friend. They shared dinners, attended his grandchildren's school events, and spent long evenings reminiscing. Tom spoke about his experiences in the war, his struggles with isolation, and the peace he'd finally begun to find. Sarah listened, her understanding and forgiveness deeper than he could have hoped for. One evening, as they sat together on her porch, Tom looked out at the setting sun. "I never thought I'd find my way back," he admitted. "It was Rex who led me here, in more ways than one." Sarah smiled, reaching down to scratch behind Rex's ears. "He's part of the family now, just like you." Tom chuckled softly, feeling the weight of those words settle into his heart. For the first time in years, he felt whole. The journey that had begun on a snowy trail, fraught with pain and regret, had brought him to a place of healing and reconnection he'd never thought possible. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tom knew he'd finally found his way home.